when you start the webinar. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. We have people from all over, so welcome to this Peregrine webinar, sponsored webinar. We appreciate you joining us today to explore, as you can see in the title, the challenges of addressing soft skills and the soft skill gap. We're going to get started right away, and we'll start by introducing ourselves. I'd like maybe my colleague, Desiree Moore. You can see her on the screen here. Desiree, why don't you just go ahead and introduce yourself to our group, and just make sure we're recording this. I think we are.
Yes, okay. It is recording. And thank you so much, Paul. I'm Desiree Moore, the Director of Marketing and Strategic Growth here at Peregrine Global Services. Prior to coming to Peregrine almost 2 years ago, I worked in nonprofit and higher education, worked in higher education for about 8 years as an administrator and a faculty member. And the subject of soft skills came up quite often as the Director of Workforce and Community Programs. So this topic is very near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to be here and discuss it with y'all today.
Great, thanks, Desiree. And my name is Paul Mallett. I'm Director of Europe, Middle East, and Africa Operations for Peregrine Global Services. I'm coming to you from Paris, France, where we have our European office. We also have offices in Asia and Tokyo, headed by Alama, and a slew of people all over the States. I think, Desiree, you're in the Wyoming office today. So my role is working with colleges and universities in what we call the EMEA region, work with schools, as well in other places, but primarily in these regions to help identify quality assurance issues, accreditation. I come from a long history of working in higher education, in administration, when I lived in Worcester, Massachusetts at Clark University. And then when I moved to Europe, I began my teaching career, and so taught in the areas of human resource management, organizational behavior here in Paris, as well as in other schools. Worked in accreditation, so worked for an accreditation organization in the States, and worked for a couple of organizations here in Europe that were developing diplomas. So I've kind of 360 in my experience, and over the last almost 5 years, I've been working with Peregrine to, as I said, help clients in schools in this region with regard to quality assurance and accreditation issues. Before I get started, we would welcome any kinds of questions or comments that you might have. There's a little chat box that if you want to drop in a question to us, we'll be monitoring that as we go through our presentation today. And any comments we'd like to hear. We learn from our audience members, our participants. Some very good ideas often come of that. We integrate it into future presentations, and you will see many other presentations come, and maybe some of your comments and ideas in those presentations. So please do feel free to ask a question or make a comment. So let's get right to our subject today, and that is really around soft skills. And I start this with this question: why are they important? And I think stepping back a little bit to look at what are the most important in terms of businesses and people hiring. What are some of the most important considerations when hiring someone? And I think the simplest answer that most people would come up with would be having the most experienced candidates. This is what is at the top of the list. But we quickly find out that there's a lot more to what makes a good team member than simply qualifications and experience. And this then turns into the area of hard skills, which are those which are measurable, tangible proficiencies that, while important in any position, are not the ultimate determinant of what makes a good employee. And I think anybody in the room recognizes that. When we talk about hard skills, we talk about those which are the technical abilities like mathematics and reading, comprehension, language, fluency, computer science, just to name a few. Whereas soft skills are those that are more, what we would say, less quantifiable. They really look at your personality traits and are equally important in the workplace and beyond. So they're rooted in behavior, in attitudes, and in values. And while soft skills have a large impact on the work that we do that's done, soft skills help to really develop the human connections that we have. They establish the sense of culture that we have, the communities that we're in the workplace. So soft skills absolutely have a positive impact in the work environment, and technical skills. So especially when we're working collaboratively, those soft skills, sort of percolate up to the top in terms of importance. And this applies both to working remotely and in person. So understanding the difference between soft and hard skills and why soft skills are absolutely essential is vital in establishing a strong and more efficient team. And we address that throughout our discussions of soft skills. As businesses continue to evolve at a rapid pace that we're seeing today and have always really watched the world of business moving ahead quickly, sometimes faster than our educational institutions, the traditional concept of career is rapidly shifting as well and being reshaped, and especially as a result of COVID and the transformation which is taking place in the work environment. So we've seen some ramping up of these changes over the last couple of years. So having transferable skills, another word really for soft skills, can be applied or should be able to be applied to really any position in any industry. And this is becoming more important every day. While for a long time, hard skills were considered sort of the professional skills, and soft skills were only viewed in some ways as your resume or CV filler, studies have shown that these types of skills, human resource professionals and businesses really tend to favor these soft skills, maybe not over hard skills, but are very much part of that process when looking at candidates. And this is really why soft skills have become an important part of the educational process and should continue to be an important part of that process. As we explore the world of soft skills, we find that many companies are now publicly listing what they want their employees to possess and new recruits to possess. And this means that they look for new recruits to have these. Here are some from Dropbox, and there are not many surprises in this list, but it really is a tall order to possess all of them. You can see things like leadership and communications and emotional intelligence. And those, again, we see repeated as we look at other companies. Here's an example of what LinkedIn reports as what is the most important for their employees and new employees to possess. And as you can see, some repetition here of those which are the most important. And even in industry, hard industries, and we find that this was a research study done by the Cambridge Market Intelligence Group that shows that some of those same types of soft skills show up as far as being important, like leadership and communications, which again pop up throughout. Now, it's important for us as educators to uncover really and understand really what's missing. As new graduates are entering the workforce, we get a lot of feedback. And this is an interesting list from the Society of Human Resource Management, which lists those types of soft skills which are considered in shortage, that graduates are really not possessing, that are looked for by businesses. And as you can see, those which the companies that I previously showed, some of those pop up on this list. So we're graduating some students who are not necessarily fully, don't necessarily have the some of these skills and these competencies, which are being required and are more and more at the top of the list of what companies and recruiters are looking for new graduates. Here's an example of a CEO, Jim Link, at Randolph North America, finds that there is a gap in these soft skills with college graduates. We don't like to see these types of things, but it's reality. This is what we're finding, this gap between what we're doing and what's actually happening and what's expected in the work environment. Here's a nice illustration, again, that companies are struggling to find candidates. We know that for other reasons during COVID, but candidates with the skills they need, these things like critical thinking, communications, listening, interpersonal skills. So the question is, why aren't our graduates possessing these skills, or not enough of them? Here's another example from Chris Kirkley at direction.com, and he sums it up pretty well in his quote, which really encapsulates the skill of emotional intelligence, meaning that, it's one thing to be able to, know about something, but important to be able to understand why people want it or need it. So I thought this was an interesting quote, again, reinforcing the notion that there's a gap there. Here's another illustration that just demonstrates that these human skills will be even more important and more in demand as jobs become more automated, which is reality. When I go to my grocery store here in Paris, there's an automated, cashier, and a lot of things that we do are automated. We have an automated health pass, so that if I want to go to a movie, or it's all automated, I don't have to show a piece of paper.
Did you hear that McDonald's will start are automating their drive-thru? So it's no longer going to be a person who's taking the order, but using artificial intelligence like a Siri or an Alexa. So there's another really great example of that.
More automated, and so we're pulling people. Now, there's a lot of ethical, social issues around removing those kinds of jobs, but this just means that as jobs become more automated, these types of human skills. So whereas one time computer and technical skills were held to be the most important for the 21st century, I think we all know, push your kid through, become a coder, whereas now leaders are saying that kind of skill ranks below some of these human skills. Not to say that the technical skills are not important. I'm not taking away from that. But these human skills, these transferable skills, these soft skills are really moving up in terms of importance, or actually have been for the last 20 years. We're reckoning with some of that even more today. Of course, there's a lot of reasons why this trend has taken place. And one that continues to be raised in academic circles is really this drop in students being required to have liberal arts courses. And as someone who studied in the liberal arts and then went on to professional diplomas, I'm glad that I had that. And I know that those were requirements back in the day. But this is one of the arguments to reintroduce some of these or reinforce some of these courses. And I'll touch on that in a minute or two. Now, although we continue to see an express need for soft skills, you'll find that a large portion of higher education feels that they are adequately preparing college students for the workforce. This survey that was done in 2017 of college and university chief academic officers, about half of the provosts in the surveys reported that they felt they were very effective in preparing students for the world of work and providing a quality undergraduate education. And although these perceptions might be a reflection of reality, there seems to be this disconnect between higher education and industry. And, the previous slides in which I showed some quotes by some CEOs and some illustrations shows that there is that gap in what some educators feel. I don't think this is true for all, but I do think that we see a pretty important percentage who think, oh, we're doing fine. So I asked this question is, why is there a disconnect between the perceptions of employers and higher education?
I you could add that to the chat box, if you're in the audience and you want to add to the chat box what you think the reason for the disconnect is, please do that. We would really appreciate hearing from you.
Yeah, because there are things we can do to improve that. I mean, we'll get into that, but I think that if you can add a comment how your institution or even other workplaces are trying to, why that gap exists, and maybe some suggestions on how to close the gap. We have some ideas here for you. So that's a question. These are skills that employers need, and how do we help as educators? And I think the first step is acknowledging that in higher education and workforce training, or the landscape of continuous higher education and lifelong learning, we have a unique position as educators that allows us to really prepare these learners and upskill professionals to meet the needs of industry, and therefore strengthening our workforce. So higher education really is in that position, both for continuing education and degree granting programs, to have an influence on closing that gap. However, based on the feedback we've received from industry, we can improve our methods of developing these soft skills. And that's one of the challenges, is how do we improve these methods of developing, assessing, and managing soft skills in higher education, so that they're prepared for the century that we're in and the future. So one of the things that I think important and that we need to face is soft skills are challenging. They're difficult to define. There's a lack of standard categorization of these. The term soft is really misleading, and a lot of people are moving away from that. Transferable skills, traveling skills, retained competencies. The perception of proficiency of these skills can be very subjective, and I think this is one of the challenges when assessing soft skills. You're likely to experience bias, being your own or that of others. So introducing, teaching, and assessing these skills is a chance for many in higher education to improve. Focusing on hard skills alone is sometimes easier, since that is what we know and that is what we're comfortable with. Also, there are many more tools that allow us to evaluate these technical skills. Peregrine has a lot of assessment tools that allow you to assess discipline-based skills, which are used by many of our client schools across the globe. So the fact that there are a lot more tools makes it easier to assess and manage, and sometimes it's harder to assess and manage these soft skills competencies, but we do have some solutions. One of the things that's important to keep in mind here is that we go from knowing what soft skills are important in business and industry, and that our students lack some of these within the eyes of recruiters and businesses. So how do we bridge this gap? And the National Association of Colleges and Employees, which is really a group representing both, have established a really important, I think, 8 areas of those types of skills and competencies that are associated with what we call career readiness. And this really can help colleges and universities create the type of experience, the college university experience, that students get to help meet the expectations of businesses and what can be seen as a more well-rounded educational experience. So there are efforts on the part of employers and higher education and organizations to bridge this gap. So we can bridge this gap between what employers see as the lack of preparation and what we're doing at our colleges and universities to close that gap. And this NACE 8 is used in a number of different accreditation agencies. Also at Peregrine, we use this to help formulate our process of assessments, and is an important one, as Desiree, when she takes over in a second, to explain one of the processes that we have in place to develop and manage and assess soft skills is based on some of these very important 8 competencies that was established through NACE. Now, that's not to say that no one's doing anything. There are schools and universities are, in fact, creating courses and modules that really directly address soft skills training. And this is an example from Western Technical College that shows that they're committed to ensuring that schools build these competencies in addition to other skills. Another example, whether it's integrated or offered as additional courses and modules, I know this is Desiree's alma mater. Colorado State has moved ahead, and I'm sure that your institution is well aware that this needs to be addressed, and maybe offering specific courses or integrating this in other places within your curriculum. And this is happening worldwide. As I mentioned, I live here in France and Paris, and I work with a client school here in France that has a very fully integrated curriculum with soft skills courses across 3 different schools. They have an engineering, a multimedia, and a business school. And students are required to take very specific skill courses in these areas and are evaluated for accreditation purposes and quality assurance purposes. So with that being said, in order to determine the effectiveness of soft skills course or modules, we kind of have to step back and we have to look at the idea of assessment. And here we have this great quote from Edward Deming. You may remember him from the quality circle, the continuous improvement circle. So you can't really manage what you don't measure. And in order to improve the notion of developing soft skills at institutions, you've got to be able to measure that. Now, I'm going to drop back a little bit and look at really one of the tools that we have adapted, or that's been adapted. I don't think we should take credit for it, but I use it an awful lot, of the Deming cycle of plan, do, check, and action. And if you look at this assessment cycle, we're looking at this at the program level, not individual courses. So as schools go through their assessment process, you're looking at, are our programs meeting our learning outcomes, both our hard skills and soft skills, our learning outcomes, which usually cover both. So we start by establishing really what our learning outcomes are, and this brings together a bunch of different things that relate to planning. And this is usually objectives that are qualitative and quantitative. And for most schools, learning outcomes will be both a mix of these hard and soft skills. In the planning stage, we have to determine the best tools that we use, and there are a lot of tools out that are available in order to assess them. And then we go ahead and we create and assess, meaning that we collect the data from those assessments that we've done based on both soft and hard skills. And we we'll address one of our tools in a minute. And then we look at studying these, evaluating where we're doing well and where we're falling behind. So if we see that the negotiations, communications, or critical thinking skills might not be what we're hoping them to be, we may need to take action. We may need to do something, which brings us to the very end of our cycle, the do cycle, which is, making a decision to look at our strengths and weaknesses and how to mitigate our weaknesses, maybe by making changes. So we want to effectively measure our learning outcomes, and this includes both hard and soft skills. And with a good quality improvement program, we repeat this cycle again and again, so that if we've made changes to our academic program, we're able to see the following cohort, if we're assessing again whether those communications, negotiations, critical thinking skills have improved by maybe making some changes to the curriculum, by adding particular courses or by enhancing courses to add some of the soft skills that are being that are part of our learning outcomes and that are needed by business and industry today. So I'm going to actually, now that we've looked at this assessment concept, we can now look at one of the tools that Peregrine has introduced to help really, you and education institutions across the globe effectively measure soft skills and help to close the gap between what organizations want with new recruits, and we want them to be skilled and to ensure that these soft skills training are effective, because you can put a lot into place, but if it's not effective, then you're wasting your time. So you have to measure it. You have to measure whether the soft skills trainings that are taking place in your academic programs are yielding the results that you want. Now I'm going to try to share this with my colleague. So
I think I can do it. Hold on just a
okay,
second.
I just shared it. See if you can flip through. I'm going to go back and invite Desiree. And again, please drop in any kind of question or comment. So
Yep,
there you go.
I'm sharing now, I think.
Yep, I
So
think I can see it.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much, Paul. That was just a great conversation on soft skills, professional skills, whatever you call them, those skills that are so vital to our success at work and in life, which I think makes them even more important. As you develop your soft skills, you'll see the benefits within your career, right? But you'll also see the benefits in your day-to-day life and your relationships with others. So we talked a little bit about the assessment cycle, and at first, we talk about identifying your objectives. And I think industry and higher education have worked together to identify what are the skills we need to develop, depending on the sector or the specific industry. But kind of the next step is, all right, how do we measure those? And that can be difficult. So Peregrine had this idea a couple years ago, right? What was it? Maybe 3 or 4 years ago, we had this idea as we were listening to these conversations of how do we even start to assess and assess objectively, or as objectively as possible. And it's been common practice to use a 360-degree assessment in the workplace as part of an ongoing talent development process. It's often used with leadership to give confidential but very good, rich feedback to leadership, really promotes the kind of feedback as a gift culture. And with a 360-degree assessment, employees receive confidential, anonymous feedback from the people who work around them. This typically includes employees, managers, peers, and direct reports. The feedback is used to gain an understanding of strengths and weaknesses as part of that continuous talent development process, very much like the continuous improvement process that you see in education. The skills measured through this process are the ones that we're talking about, such as teamwork, character, leadership effectiveness. Now, one thing I want to mention, Paul talked about the various terms that we use for soft skills. I like to call them competencies, because a skill is the ability to do something like maybe like mop a floor, right? That's probably not the best example, but the one that came to mind, where a competency is kind of a collection of skills and abilities meshed together, right? So that you can do something competently or proficiently. So maybe with emotional intelligence, you have to have good communication skills, right? In addition to, it's all of those parts and pieces playing together for that one skill or that one competency. So you'll hear me use that interchangeably. So I want to talk to you about how we utilize Evaluator Skills. I'm going to talk about how it works. This 360-degree assessment, how we were able to create it to be as objective and accurate measure of the relative competency levels, and how they're used, how we have used this assessment data to develop skills of students. I'm going to share with you in particular a case study of the results of the school that we worked with. Now, I want to tell you now that next week we are going to be doing a deep dive into Evaluator Skills, where we're going to discuss Evaluator Skills a little bit more. That is going to be the focus of the entire presentation. And Paul and my colleague Christina will actually be utilizing case studies of how schools have integrated this into their programs. So if you have some ideas of, I wonder if this would work, that would be a great presentation to go to get a little bit more information. But let's go ahead and dive into what Evaluator Skills does. So what I think is really nice is that it has an easy to use interface, right? As you know, time as and energy are the most valuable commodities that we have in higher education. And so we want the tools that we're using to be easy. You can create and manage various instruments. An instrument is a collection of assessment items, okay, to address specific needs of different groups of participants. So let's say you have your majors in business administration that you want to assess, and maybe there are different skills within those different concentrations that are important to you based on your conversations with industry, or maybe nursing versus construction, or, you have different cohorts. So you can easily have those different groups of students by major, whether they're online or traditional, and you can manage the assessment of those different groups. You can see and track the progress of evaluation. So, and we'll talk about that evaluation process, so you'll understand why that's important. And then generate reports, which we need reports, we need data in order to conduct the continuous improvement cycle. What's also neat about Evaluator Skills is that it's very flexible and customizable, right? I've talked about, depending on the industry, you're going to need different skills, or there's skills that are going to rise to the top. And so we have made it so that you can do that. And of course, we want you to use us, the expertise of our team, to customize assessments, selecting from a database of over 200 skills and their corresponding rubrics. You can also write or develop your own skills and rubrics and add them to your assessment. I'm working with a school right now where they've already determined 9 skills. And so some of our skills and rubrics work great for them, about 5 out of those 9, but we're going to develop the other 4. So that way it's really meeting their needs as far as assessment of soft skills. Now, here's a great analogy for instrument creation, that collection of assessment items that you're going to use to assess your student. Ordering a pizza. Maybe you've been to a pizzeria, maybe. And usually what happens when you're there is there's several pizzas on the menu, right? There's a place in Steamboat Springs, Colorado that I really like. It's called How You Doing Pizza. And they have one called Getting Figgy with it, right? And it has fig and prosciutto, and I really like it. But it's kind of pre-built, right? All of those different toppings are already put together. But sometimes I don't want anything that's on the menu. I want to build my own. So in Evaluator Skills, the ingredients are the assessment items, the individual skills you want to assess, such as dependability, innovation, critical thinking, etc. And to make your pizza, you can choose from the available instrument templates, or you can create your own pizza. So I've talked about the customizability of it, but we've also have some pre-created assessment instruments. So that way, if you don't want to sift through 200 plus skills, or maybe we already have an instrument that meets your needs because we've partnered with one of the accrediting agencies, and we know what they require you to measure your students on. We have those pre-created for you, just like that pizza I love from
But there's no pineapple available. We definitely don't want pineapple.
What? No, there's definitely pineapple. So what I think is the most significant and my favorite feature of Evaluator Skills is the objectivity behind it. Now, I know you're asking yourself, like, how do you objectively measure soft skills? And I can't say it's 100% objective because there is a human element and human judgment in place, but I would say it's quite as objective as you can get. And the reason being is because we have these closed-ended 5-point Likert scale rubrics for each skill that concentrate on the behavior and not the person. If you were to ask me, hey, Desiree, how do you like Paul's communication skills? Do you think he's a good communicator? Well, Paul is one of my favorite people. So for me, I would say he's the best communicator, right? I give him, 5 stars all the way through. But I have a bias because Paul is not only my colleague, but he's my friend. And so because of that, I need these statements, these behavior statements that I can read and I can say, does Paul do that thing? And objective, and look at it objectively. And then, so each rubric comes with a statement, a behavior, and scaling to help your evaluators kind of stay grounded in their evaluations and remove bias from them. They also have the ability to write feedback, your evaluators, adding a level of richness to the data. Now, I've talked about the instrument report, which is a collection of assessment items. What's really nice is that you can print it out, you can create it and have a printable PDF. That's really nice because you can send it to your students and they can look through it and have a really clear idea of what they're going to be measured on and what the criteria is. You have the option to choose evaluators for your learners. But you can also require that your learners choose their own evaluators, or you can do a mix of them. You can require that the school I'm working with right now, they want to do a peer evaluator, a faculty evaluator, and then they want somebody that they currently work with in their internship. And so there's a couple different evaluators that they're requiring their students to have. If your students are older students or already in the workplace, maybe they can draw from that pool. If they're not, if they're traditional age students, and maybe peer evaluators are a great option if they've worked in teams or team projects. But you can decide whether you set the evaluators or whether they identify the evaluators.
I'm working with a school that is very strict on the evaluators. They do not want the student to choose. So it's going to be the faculty advisor that advises the student during their program, and their internship, because the school requires every student to have a 8 or 9 month internship, and it's a required internship, and they're a manager at the company. So, and they want the student to self evaluate. So they're making it very clear these are the evaluations. But as Desiree said, in some cases, depending on the environment, you may want the student to be able to add evaluators in on that. But in this case, it was very strict because the accreditor wanted as little bit of as least amount of bias, so they didn't want the student choosing. So that kind of reduced the number of evaluators to really only 3.
Well, and that brings me to a really great point, the number of evaluators. Of course, more evaluators means more data, means those averages are going to be a little bit better. So we looked at that 5-point Likert scale, right? So it's 5 points, so they can rate them on a scale from 1 to 5. And the more evaluators you have, the better those averages are going to be, right? They're the more reflective of your student's skill. But I mean, you could do 3 evaluators, 5 evaluators. We just recommend that you have at least 3. So that way, first of all, for the confidentiality and so that your data actually has is enough. It's enough data. So we've talked a little bit about building the assessment. We've talked about how you choose the evaluators. Everything is done completely online. It's a 100% online platform. Once you enroll your students will create their own value skills account where they can kind of track their assessment, whether that be download their instrument report and look at the skills they're being assessed on. They can track whether evaluators have completed the evaluation, and evaluators will be sent an email invitation to evaluate your students. Evaluators will rate the participant on the selected skills, comparing their experience with the participant against all of those things that we looked at on the rubric. And once the evaluation is done and you have your assessment results back, you are able to generate a variety of reports. And these are the reports that we have. We have a participant report that compares the participant score against the average evaluator score and the average group score. Now, that is something that I want to make sure I mention, is that you have the ability for students to be able to evaluate themselves. Of course, that is not objective, but it provides some really great teaching moments. And we'll talk about some of those in just a little bit when I share this case study with you. And then a participant action plan report, and we'll go over that, and then group reports with average self and evaluator scores for the group and a breakdown of those who perform significantly higher or lower than the group in each skill. So here is just an example of the participant report. So in this particular graph, the report shows the participants' total average score across all competencies. You can see this blue line here. And that kind of shows the participants' average score, making it easy to highlight relative strengths and weaknesses for improvement. And then you have the participant self-score here, the 4.0, the evaluator average, the 3.8, and then the 4.15 is the group average. And this is on the competency, emotional intelligence. And why this is nice is the students score themselves higher than their evaluator average, right? 0.2 higher. So maybe that's a little bit of a blind spot for the student. A lot of times when we have less knowledge in something, we'll inflate our aptitude or our proficiency in it. So maybe I'm not a very good communicator. Maybe I don't know what makes a good communicator, but because of that, when somebody asks me how well I communicate, maybe I'll say I'm a 5. And then I find out that my peers think I'm a 3, and that tells me I have a glaring blind spot, and it's probably an area where I need to gain some self-awareness, and then also mitigate that weakness. And then you can see where you compare to your group, which is really nice. All right, so the action plan, which I talked about a little bit earlier, the reason this is nice is for individual development. So students are going to get their participant report after they complete the assessment. So in addition to utilizing this for program improvement and to ensure that you're developing the skills of students in your program, students get to use this at the individual level, which provides a whole lot of value. And the action plan is it can be incorporated as an assignment in a course. It could just be a value added. It's up to you, but it gives them the opportunity to highlight strengths to sustain, note weaknesses to improve, and ask for a timeline and a person to hold them accountable. Sometimes just the act of thinking about our results and thinking about what we could do to improve can do wonders in helping students develop. And it's something that they can carry with them into their careers and the future. Now, we started this conversation talking about program assessment and how assessment is important to higher education. Because you can't manage what you don't measure, right? We can't develop soft skills if we don't measure them. And so Evaluator provides you with a rich assortment of group reports that you can use for continuous program improvement. Here is in my group report, this one you see here, you'll see that I'm strong in accountability, but could use some help in valuing diversity. And this is at the group level, right? So this is my program. My program is strong in accountability, but could definitely use some help in valuing diversity. So if I received that kind of information about my program, what would I do? Well, I probably would say, we need some help in valuing diversity, but that's really important to our program objectives. So what are some projects? Maybe it's something to do with the knowledge that is kind of integrated, the concepts that are introduced throughout the course of the program. What are some things that we can do to help students understand the value of diversity a little bit better?
And just before you go, this was an interesting tool that's been used by many schools that are using this when they do an alignment with their learning outcomes. So you've a set of learning outcomes which measure both hard and soft skills, if you will, and that graph that Desiree just showed you, the previous one, if you find that your learning outcome measurement that you've established, a certain percentage of students will have these particular scores on these particular learning outcomes. This allows you to very quickly identify whether you're meeting your learning outcomes that you've established or whether you're not meeting them. So this is this group report, and as this one shows, it depends on how you've established those learning outcomes. So when I meet with a school, we go through all of their learning outcomes and we say, okay, how do these align with the different available items that you can assess out of those 200 if they're not using something that's standardized. And so they create it, and then when the data comes out, they can just look very quickly and say, oh, we're meeting it on these, items, communications we're doing fine, negotiations, but accountability and diversity, which is on our list of learning outcomes, we're below what our benchmark was set, because this is what accreditors want you to do. They want you to dig deep enough, and the group report will give you enough data to be able to either think about it, respond to it, make a decision, maybe not make a decision. But in terms of the continued improvement process, the participant report is great for participants and students. We use the word participant, but group reports really for you in the institution provide you with that, as Desiree pointed out, that rich data that allows you to, make, that circle, make some decisions that are, effective because they're based on this good data that you've been collecting.
Perfect. Thank you so much for adding that in, Paul. So one other thing that I think is really neat and that we should do, a lot of times when we're looking at our data, we're looking at a snapshot in time. It's hard to understand if the changes we're making or the things we're doing are having an impact on education. What's really nice is you can measure change and growth over time because you always have access to all assessment results, right? And you can conduct longitudinal analysis with a pre and post-test construct. So a lot of schools, what they'll do is they'll have a value skill, they'll use it at the beginning of a program, and then they'll use it again at the end of the program, and they'll see if there was a change, right, in that time. And we're going to go over a case study in which that was the construct that they used, and I'll show you the results. All right. So here you can see a school, WSB, that we worked with. And they developed an Executive Master of Business Administration and Leadership program in 2019. So for short, EMBA in leadership. And this was an 18-hour course or 18-course program with 12-month applied leadership project and mentoring. So it was a very project-based program, which is really nice to accompany a tool like Evaluator Skills. They adopted Evaluator Skills to objectively measure students' relative soft skills, and Peregrine mapped out their assessment items from Evaluator Skills to the program's competencies. And the incoming students were assessed in 2019 and then again in 2020 at the end of the program. So here we just have a look at their intended outcomes. I'm not going to read all of these, but you can see a lot of these are soft in nature, right? Manage and work within a team-based environment, think and act in an entrepreneurial manner, solve the decision-related problems which are included in the key competencies of the modern manager, right? So a lot of them were very much leadership-based, which makes sense given the program. So the rubrics were designed such that a score of 3 is competent or meets expectations. Just like Paul was talking about, you're going to set that benchmark. The evaluator scores are relative to the situation. That is, a score of 3 is a desirable score. Such scoring, making that desirable score 3, was deliberate to help keep the scores from becoming inflated. For the purpose of program level assessments, the target was a positive average score change from at least a 0.20, right? They wanted to see from pre-assessment, right, at the beginning of the program to the end of the program, there be a positive change of 0.2. The change in scores is an important metric, and the concept of the assessment process is to measure how the academic program changed the students or the learners. Although it is noteworthy that positive change was indicated based on self-evaluations, you'll see here, these are the results. So you'll, of using the data to drive, self-evaluations are fine. What matters most is how evaluators perceive the assessed individual. So you'll see here the self-assessment scores. I just thought it would be interesting to share it with you. And so you can see here that most of the time the students rated themselves higher at the end of the program than they did at the beginning of the program. But we're going to take a closer look at those percentage changes in just a minute and discuss why they are notable to a degree. So this is the evaluator scores. And again, if you look at the graph, from afar, you can kind of see that mostly it's an upward trend, right? Of the elements that were measured, we show positive change. 30 of the elements had a significant score change from pre-program to post-program. Okay. At the assessment level, 6 out of 15 of the assessment items. So these are the assessment items. Scores changed based on perspectives of evaluators, which suggests that the EMBA in leadership program had a positive influence on the learners.
I think it's interesting if you go back 1 second, I just noticed something, that one of the things that is probably, well, why in decision making would you think you're better at decision making at the beginning of an MBA program, and at the end you feel like you're less proficient or less proficient? And I think that actually makes sense, because you learn what you don't know. You learn that you know less. So decision making is a lot harder. So, you're less, you think you're more qualified than you really are. So it's actually probably advisable and want people, when they do the post assessment, to say, gee, after going through an MBA program, I realized that, decision making is a lot harder than I ever imagined it to be. So, and prior to it, I think I'm great. I can make decisions because, I'm Superman or Superwoman. But after going through a program and realizing the component parts of decision making, you realize that I'm not quite as good as I thought I was. So I think that that's an interesting, when I'm looking at this, it just makes sense that might be one where you feel like, okay, here I realize decision making isn't what I thought it was all about.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, Paul, and I'll tell you why. So if you look at this decision making, right, this is a self-assessment, right? So as you stated, they scored themselves fairly well at the beginning of the program, and not as well at the end of the program. And if you look at our evaluator scores, right, the external people evaluating them, they also scored them better at the beginning and then not as well at the end. And I have some ideas about that. So I'm really glad you said that, because I want to share. So here you can see, this is a graph that shows percentage change. And so here you can see those, the percentage change. And this is the change, the green is the change in self-score, and the blue is the change in evaluator score. And look at the areas which seem to have like negative growth, right? And you have decision making, you have listening, coaching, one of those. And thinking about this, the program, they assessed themselves in 2019 and then again in 2020. Now, if you think about what happened, right? Because the areas that suffered were decision-making, coaching, setting priorities, and delegating, it's understandable that issues or environmental factors such as COVID-19 may have also had an impact, right? So I think that my leader that I'm working with is a great decision maker. All of a sudden we're hit with the pandemic, and I don't feel that way about him before, because his decision-making skills were pushed to the test during that period. And for all of us, right? And so I think it's interesting, and I would like to see the longitudinal data.
Well, I think that I was going to say that's an important thing, because we're looking at one cohort, when you look at this across a number of years, that's where the data then really, because one data point doesn't a trend make. No. But, and that's what you're looking at over time. This is going to be a snapshot. There's lots of environmental issues. I think you're very right in saying that, but you got to be able to look longitudinally at data over several cohorts before making program changes. You don't make a program change because one element comes lower than your expectation. It's very important. One data point doesn't make a trend.
Absolutely. Well, and you had talked about students feeling, having more confidence in an area that they know less about, right? And that's actually called the Kruger-Dunning effect, which is really interesting, because you will often, the more you know about something, the less proficient you feel in that area. So if somebody were to ask Desiree today, I'm the director of marketing, how proficient do you feel in marketing? And let's give you the honest answer. Say, oh gosh, I have a lot to learn, right? But if you were to ask me a long time ago, very long time ago, I probably would have felt like, oh, I know a lot about marketing. And I know so much more today than I did back then when I thought I knew a lot. And that's a Kruger-Dunning effect. We overestimate our ability in something when we don't know a lot about it. But as we grow and learn about it, then we underestimate their ability. So a lot of the students that you're going to see who, maybe they score themselves, let's say as a 2 on communication, and then their evaluations come in and they're a 3.5. The reason they're scoring themselves so low is part of that Kruger-Dunning effect. They have so much knowledge in the area that they can easily see their blind spots or their glaring issues, where other people around them don't see it.
Mhm.
Okay, so from a programmatic evaluation of learning outcomes, this specific assessment represents just one data point. Based on the first data point, it appears that the EMBA in leadership program had a positive and consequential impact on student skill development. So the next cohort is going through the program, and we will utilize this Evaluator Skills, because assessment is not something that you do just once, but something you do over and over again, so we can do those longitudinal studies. So for continuous improvement, based on what they found, the gaps, 5 items showed a negative change, including coaching, delegating, decision-making. Maybe it was the pandemic. It's really hard because we just have one data point. Repeated evaluation of the new cohort will be used to see if there is a gap in competency development there. And so I'm going to wrap up really quick, but when we measure soft skills, we can assess and demonstrate learning outcomes, strengthen our workforce, develop the competencies that students need to get the job and keep it, and enhance long-term personal and professional development of learners, and provide areas for programmatic improvement. And then there's our contact information. You're welcome to reach out to Paul or I will be sending you a follow-up email within the next 24 hours. So look forward to hearing from me. And that is the end. Do we have any questions? We just have a moment for questions.
A moment. Actually, I think you can stop. Well, you can just continue with yours. I see a question, and I can't read the name of the person. Is a question about, do you advise that we assess the entire cohort, or do we assess a group of people within the cohort? And that's a really good question, because it really relates to your accreditation requirements and what your objectives are. Of course, the more you assess, the better it is. But especially when starting this out, this is a new process for some. I work with schools, and we'll set up a pilot where we'll say, okay, out of your MBA program, let's randomly select this number of students, or if you're in an undergraduate program. This really works well with both groups, but in particular on postgraduate programs. So it's not necessarily to have, if you have 20,000 students in your program, it's all automated, and you certainly can do that. And we have big schools that are doing that. But initially, I suggest doing a pilot with, a number of students that you can use as a representative sample. So that would be my question, my response to that answer. There's some questions about pricing. We have pricing, of course, is available on our website. We have what's called volume discounting. So the assessment, no matter how many assessment items you have, each assessment is $45. As you move up in terms of the number of assessment, that number goes down. We work with a lot of schools to set up what we call a site licensing agreement. So as we go through, obviously working with institutions, and that includes all of the setup. There's no cost for reports. There's no cost for working with someone like Desiree or myself in setting this up and determining what your learning outcomes might be, how to align them. I work a long time with schools before this is ever put into place, because we want to make sure that we're doing it right. So all of the services that we provide up to and after putting it into place, reading reports, understanding reports, generating reports, that's all included in that $45 goes down to 40 and then 36, depending on the numbers that you have. So, we have a very, a competitive pricing. This is available on our website, and Desiree will certainly give you links to that information. We're very transparent with all of that.
Absolutely.
And I think
And
that's about all we have time. We have some other questions, but we're hitting the top of the hour here.
Yes, yes. And I'll just add really quick, for community colleges, we do offer special discount pricing because of the nature of community colleges. So if you belong to that group, let us know and we'll tell you what we can do. But anyway, or for 2-year associate degrees, we provide special pricing. So if you're not at a community college, but you have a 2-year degree, it also applies there. But we'll go ahead and let you go. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Paul, for the wonderful presentation and discussion.
Have a good day.
So
it's the end of the day here, so we're about finished with our day. So again, it was a pleasure.
All right.